The dust on the county road didn't just settle, it seemed to mourn. For 80 years, the Miller farm had been a fixture of the valley, a sprawling expanse of emerald green cornstalks and weathered timber that breathed life into the local economy. But today, the air tasted like copper and iron. A line of cruisers, their lights pulsing like a warning heartbeat against the midday sun, formed an impenetrable barricade at the main gate. This wasn't a routine inspection or a tax delinquency notice taped to a door. This was an eviction, executed with the cold, sterile efficiency of a machine. Sheriff Elias Thorne, a man whose uniform looked as starched and unyielding as his reputation, stepped out of his vehicle. He wasn't there to mediate, he was there to finalize the death of a legacy. As the sheriff approached the farmhouse, the porch creaked under his boots, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the heavy silence. Arthur Miller, a man whose skin was mapped with the history of the land he had tilled since he could walk, stood by the screen door. He didn't look like a criminal, yet the heavy steel handcuffs dangling from Thorne's belt suggested otherwise. The contrast was visceral, the raw, unrefined humanity of a farmer clinging to his soil versus the sterile, detached authority of the state. It was the classic battle, the individual against the overwhelming weight of institutional power. Most people watching this scene unfold would assume it was a simple case of debt, a sad but predictable outcome of the modern agricultural struggle. But the story hidden beneath the surface was far more jagged. The community had been whispering for weeks. They knew the bank had been circling like vultures, but nobody expected the sheriff to move with such brutal, swift intent. People lined the fence, their faces blurred shapes of anxiety and indignation. They saw the life of a family being dismantled in real time, their memories reduced to boxes stacked in the dirt. Thorne pushed past Arthur, his voice a gravelly monotone as he recited the legal jargon that signaled the end. The viewers of this tragedy saw the injustice clearly, but the true horror was how quiet the world remained. Laws, after all, are often written in stone, but they are enforced by men, and men are prone to pride, error, and shadows. As the sheriff began the process of locking the gates, a black sedan turned slowly off the highway. It wasn't a cruiser, and it wasn't a bank vehicle. It rolled to a stop, crunching gravel with a deliberate, slow pace. The tension in the air shifted instantly. Sheriff Thorne paused, his hand hovering over his radio, a flicker of confusion crossing his stoic features. A man stepped out, a figure of calm precision in a charcoal suit, clutching a leather briefcase that looked far too heavy for the setting. This was Judge Marcus Sterling, a man whose name was whispered in courthouses with either profound reverence or deep-seated fear. He didn't look like a hero, he looked like a correction. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who Sterling was, and more importantly, he knew why he was there. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the weight of impending revelation. The onlookers held their breath, sensing that the script they thought they were watching had just been torn to shreds. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his holster, a reflex born of decades on the force, but Sterling didn't even look at him. He walked straight toward the farmhouse, his eyes locked on the front door where Arthur stood. The sheriff barked a command, "This property is under state mandate, Judge. You have no standing here." Sterling stopped, turned his head just enough to offer a thin, razor-sharp smile, and said, "Sheriff, you are about to find out that you aren't the only one who knows how to read the law." The atmosphere shifted from a cold, mechanical eviction to a volatile standoff. You have to understand the framing here. The sheriff represents the law as it exists on the surface, black and white, absolute, and unyielding. The judge represents the law in its deeper, more dangerous form, a system that can be manipulated, interpreted, and weaponized. The conflict wasn't about land, it was about the fundamental misuse of power. If you've ever felt like the system was rigged against you, like the rules only apply when they favor the powerful, then you know exactly what Arthur was feeling in that moment. But what happened next, the bad news the judge brought, was something that would shake the entire foundation of this county. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a detonation. The silence following the judge's arrival was not merely an absence of sound, it was the heavy, suffocating pressure of a secret being ripped into the light. Sheriff Thorne's face paled beneath his weathered tan. He looked at the paperwork in his hand, then back at Judge Sterling, who hadn't even opened his briefcase yet. The crowd leaning against the fence, the neighbors who had watched their own fortunes decline alongside Arthur's, shifted restlessly. They sensed a turning point. They had come to watch a funeral for a farm, but they were witnessing a surgical strike against the local establishment. "Sheriff," Sterling began, his voice devoid of theatricality, which only made it more terrifying. "You've spent the better part of the morning acting on a court order that, as of exactly 48 hours ago, ceased to exist. I suspect you already knew that. The question is, did you believe the paperwork would catch up to you before you finished your work?" Thorne spat on the dirt, a desperate attempt to regain a shred of masculine dominance. "I got an order from the district court, Judge. My job is to execute the mandate. I don't care about your private interpretations. Get off the property." But Sterling was unmoved. He stepped closer, invading the sheriff's personal space. He opened the briefcase, not to reveal a weapon, but to reveal a single, thick envelope bound in red ribbon, a signal of a federal injunction. "The problem, Elias," the judge said, using the sheriff's first name with a familiarity that cut deeper than any insult, "is that you bypassed the jurisdictional audit. You didn't just seize a farm, you seized a protected easement that was placed under federal oversight during the 1994 drought resolution. The bank didn't tell you that, did they? They let you be the blunt instrument of their fraud because they knew you'd take the heat when the inevitable inquiry began." The revelation rippled through the onlookers. The bad news wasn't just that the eviction was being halted, it was that the entire legal justification for the sheriff's actions was a fabrication designed to protect a massive, backroom land grab. The sheriff had been played. He was the fall guy for a multi-million-dollar real estate development conglomerate that had been quietly buying up the valley's debt to consolidate water rights. Arthur Miller, standing on his porch, finally spoke. His voice was raspy, unused to the confrontation. "They told me I was bankrupt, Judge. They told me the interest rates had ballooned because of the failed crop insurance payout. I thought I'd lost it all." "You haven't lost a thing, Arthur," the judge replied, finally turning his back on the sheriff. "In fact, you've just inherited a very significant claim against the county and the lender. The framing of this narrative is crucial for understanding why these stories captivate us. We are wired to root for the underdog, but we are also deeply skeptical of the system. When we see an authority figure like the sheriff being manipulated by an even higher authority, the power dynamic becomes a thriller. The bad news for the sheriff was that he wasn't the top of the food chain, he was just a pawn. And pawns, by definition, are the first pieces to be sacrificed when the game gets difficult. As the sheriff stood there, his radio crackling with confused dispatches from his deputies who were just as lost as he was, the reality of his position settled in. His badge, once a symbol of absolute authority in this valley, now looked like a target. Sterling pulled out a phone and made a single, short call. Within minutes, the sound of a different kind of engine, not a cruiser, but a sleek, official vehicle marked with the insignia of the State Bureau of Investigation, could be heard approaching from the highway. The sheriff's officers began to slowly withdraw toward their vehicles, their bravado evaporating in the face of an inquiry that was clearly already in motion. What we are witnessing is the dismantling of a narrative. For years, the town believed the Miller farm was a failure of management. The truth was far more malicious. It was a failure of ethics. By peeling back the layers of this eviction, we aren't just looking at land, we are looking at the mechanics of greed. Every section of this story reveals a new layer of the conspiracy. Why did the bank wait until today? Why was the sheriff so eager? And what was so valuable about the land beneath the cornstalks that someone was willing to commit federal fraud to seize it? The answers lead to a place the town elders feared to tread, a nexus of local politics and hidden wealth that had been bleeding the community dry for decades. The judge stood firm on the porch, a silent sentinel protecting the threshold of the Miller home. He looked at the sheriff, who was now sweating profusely, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the paperwork in his hand was no longer a shield, but evidence of his own complicity. The bad news was just the beginning of the undoing of this county's power structure. The retreat of the sheriff's deputies was not a dignified exit, it was a frantic, disorganized scramble. They climbed into their cruisers, avoiding eye contact with the townspeople who had gathered at the gate. The power dynamic had completely inverted. 20 minutes ago, they were the iron fist of the law, now, they were potential suspects in a federal investigation. Sheriff Thorne remained the last one standing on the driveway, a man suddenly marooned on an island of his own making. Judge Sterling didn't move to arrest him, not yet. He simply stood there, a quiet, immovable object, watching the dust settle around the sheriff's boots. "You should go, Elias," the judge said softly. "The agents coming up that road aren't here to negotiate. They're here to inventory. And I suggest you think very carefully about who you're going to protect when the questioning starts. Is it the developers who gave you a campaign donation, or your own pension?" Thorne looked at the Miller farmhouse, then at the judge, and finally at the black sedan parked strategically across the driveway, blocking his departure path. He realized he was in a trap of his own design. He turned and drove away, not with sirens blaring, but in a humiliating, slow crawl that signaled his surrender. The tension that had held the crowd breathless finally snapped, replaced by a low, buzzing murmur of disbelief. Arthur Miller sank into a porch chair, his hands shaking as the adrenaline of the last hour began to bleed out of his system. But why did the land matter so much? To the average person, it was just dirt, a stretch of rows and irrigation ditches. To those in the shadows, however, it was the key to a multi-million-dollar infrastructure project that had been kept under lock and key. The soil wasn't the point, it was the mineral rights and the natural aquifer that ran directly beneath the Miller homestead. The developers knew that if they could force Arthur out, the land would be reassigned through a distressed asset auction, an auction they had already rigged. This is the contrast that fuels high-retention storytelling. On one side, we have the tangible struggle of a farmer working for his livelihood. On the other, the cold, abstract, and predatory world of corporate interests. When we frame the story this way, the audience doesn't just watch a man save his home, they watch a David and Goliath battle against a system that dehumanizes everyone it touches. The bad news the judge brought wasn't just for the sheriff, it was a wake-up call for the entire county. As the state investigators arrived, the scene transformed into a hub of activity. Photographers began documenting the property lines, and agents in charcoal windbreakers started cross-referencing maps with the bank's original seizure documents. Sterling stayed back, his role shifting from a guardian to a conductor. He had set the stage, and now the process of dismantling the conspiracy was moving forward with the inevitability of a glacier. Arthur walked down the porch steps toward the judge, his eyes searching for answers that weren't easily spoken. "Why?" Arthur asked, looking at the investigators swarming his fields. "Why help me now? Why not months ago when the threats first started?" Sterling turned, his expression unreadable, eyes sharp as glass. "Because, Arthur, if I had come to you months ago, we wouldn't have been able to catch them in the act. They needed to believe they were invincible. They needed to move forward with the seizure so that we could prove the intent. Greed is a predictable emotion, and I used it to lure them into the light. The bad news for them isn't that they lost your farm. The bad news is that they gave me exactly what I needed to dismantle their entire operation." The story hits a critical turning point here. We move from the physical confrontation to the psychological weight of the situation. We realize the judge has been orchestrating this for months, using Arthur's farm as the bait. This is where the audience starts to question everything they've seen so far. Was Arthur a victim, or was he a piece on the board, just like the sheriff? The ambiguity is intentional. It keeps the viewer questioning the moral landscape. The hero of this story is not necessarily the person with the most power, but the person with the most patience. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the fields, the scale of what had been uncovered became apparent. It wasn't just one farm. The agents pulled out file after file, revealing a map of the valley covered in red ink, dozens of properties, all seized under similar, dubious circumstances, all tied back to the same parent company. The scale of the theft was breathtaking. It was a systematic cleansing of the countryside, a quiet, bloodless coup that had been operating in plain sight for years. The judge stood amidst the gathering chaos, a calm center in a storm of bureaucracy. He looked at the horizon, watching the colors shift from gold to an bruised, electric purple. He knew that by tomorrow, the national news would pick up the story, and the quiet, forgotten valley would become the center of a political earthquake. But for tonight, the only thing that mattered was that the Miller farm was still standing. The sheriff's cruisers were gone, replaced by the persistent, steady presence of state authorities. The battle for the land had been won, but the war for the truth was only just beginning. The investigation didn't stop at the property line. As the night deepened, the Miller farmhouse became a nerve center. Floodlights were rigged to the side of the barn, turning the exterior into a bright, sterile stage where the drama of the afternoon continued to play out. Inside the kitchen, a space that should have been filled with the scent of dinner, there was only the hum of high-end scanners and the rapid-fire typing of laptops. Judge Sterling sat at the oak table, his presence as commanding as a king's, while the lead state investigator, a woman named Sarah Vance, laid out the findings. The documents recovered from the sheriff's cruiser were merely the tip of the iceberg. They were the execution orders, but beneath them sat the true architecture of the crime, a series of backdated shell company acquisitions. The developers hadn't just bought the debt, they had created the debt. They had purchased the regional loan servicing agency 3 years prior and systematically adjusted the amortization schedules of local farmers to ensure that, no matter how hard they worked or how profitable their harvest, they would eventually default. It was a digital guillotine, calibrated to drop at the most inconvenient moment for the landowners. "It's brilliant," in a sick sort of way, Vance whispered, tracing a line on a ledger. "They didn't break down the doors with weapons, they broke down the foundation with interest rate swaps and false environmental hazard assessments. Arthur, these documents show they fabricated a soil acidity report 3 months ago. They claimed your land was toxic, then used that to force a remediation clause in your contract, which allowed them to accelerate your payment schedule by 60%. It was a setup from the jump." Arthur sat in a corner, his head in his hands. The relief he felt was now curdling into a cold, hard anger. He had blamed himself for 3 years. He had worked until his knuckles bled, cut out every luxury, and even sold his grandfather's tractor to make ends meet, all while believing he was just a man failing at the trade he loved. To find out that his suffering had been an engineering project, a line item in someone's quarterly earnings report, was a violation that went far deeper than a simple land seizure. "Why me?" Arthur finally asked. "Why go to such lengths for a small stretch of the valley?" Sterling looked up from his files. "Because of the subterranean water rights, Arthur. The new pipeline project planned for this region requires the aquifer beneath your land. They needed the property to secure the municipal water contract. You weren't just a farmer to them, you were a gatekeeper. By removing you, they weren't just taking land, they were taking the resource that would have made you a competitor to their own distribution network. They didn't just want your farm, they wanted your future." This section of the story is the reveal of intent. In high-retention storytelling, the audience needs to move from the what to the why. If the what is a dramatic scene of an eviction, the why is the dark, universal truth about power. Everyone in the audience has felt cheated by a system they couldn't see. By making the bad news a revelation of a systemic, calculated conspiracy, the stakes are elevated from one man's struggle to the struggle of every person watching. It transforms the viewer from a spectator into an accomplice to the truth. As the hours ticked past midnight, the strategy for the following day began to solidify. The state had enough now, not just to stop the sheriff, but to issue a warrant for the CEO of the parent company, a man named Sterling's old rival, Julian Thorne. Yes, the sheriff's brother. The connection was the final piece of the puzzle. The sheriff provided the physical muscle. And the brother provided the legal and financial camouflage. It was a family business. Built on the destruction of other families. Sterling stood up, his joints popping in the quiet room. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark fields. "They think they still have the upper hand," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final verdict. "They think the sheriff is just being cautious, and will try again in the morning with a different set of papers. They don't know that the federal injunction I filed this afternoon voids their authority across the entire county. When they show up tomorrow morning, expecting to find you gone, they're going to find the state police waiting for them. And not the local ones. The ones they can't bribe." The atmosphere in the house shifted from exhaustion to a cold, focused anticipation. The bad news for the bad guys was only getting worse. They were playing a game of chess, but the judge had already tipped the board and changed the rules. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same institutions they had used to oppress the farmers, the courts, the law, the regulations, were now the very tools being used to execute their downfall. The story was reaching its crescendo. We had seen the confrontation, the realization, and now the preparation for the ultimate reckoning. The viewer is left with the burning question: what happens when the predators realize they've been hunted? The sun didn't rise over the valley the next morning, it simply bled into existence through a thick, gray mist that clung to the cornstalks. By 7 a.m., the gate to the Miller farm was no longer the site of a tragic eviction, but the epicenter of a historic collapse. A black luxury SUV pulled up to the perimeter, the kind of vehicle that screamed entitlement and impatience. Julian Thorne, the CEO of the development conglomerate, stepped out. He was dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than the tractor Arthur had been forced to sell. He didn't look angry, he looked annoyed. He expected to find a vacated property. His victory lap delayed by nothing more than a stubborn, penniless farmer. He walked toward the farmhouse with the casual gait of a man who owned the horizon. He didn't even notice the unmarked vans parked behind the barn, or the men in dark, tactical gear standing in the shadows of the machinery shed. He only saw the farmhouse, still standing, and Judge Sterling sitting on the front porch with a steaming cup of coffee. "Arthur, pack your things," Julian barked, not even glancing at the judge. "We're done playing games." The injunction was a temporary stall. "My attorney's already filed the countermotion. The sheriff is currently finalizing the paperwork to remove you by noon, and I'm here to personally ensure there isn't a repeat of yesterday's incompetence." Sterling didn't move. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. The contrast was absolute, the frenetic, arrogant energy of the predator versus the glacial, immovable calm of the architect of justice. "You're a little late for the eviction, Julian," the judge said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet morning air. "And you're significantly mistaken about who is in charge of this property." Julian stopped, finally turning his gaze toward the judge. For the first time, a flicker of genuine confusion touched his eyes. "Sterling. What are you doing here? This is a private matter. Your jurisdiction ended at the county line, and I have the governor's office on speed dial." "That's exactly the problem," Sterling replied, standing up. "You've spent so much time relying on your connections that you forgot to check if they were still valid. You see, the bad news isn't just that you've lost the farm. It's that the state attorney general doesn't like being used as a pawn in your private real estate schemes." At that moment, the doors of the unmarked van swung open. State agents stepped out, their badges glinting in the morning light. Behind them, a convoy of police vehicles, not the local sheriff's men, but a tactical unit from the regional jurisdiction, swarmed the entrance. The perimeter was sealed in seconds. Julian's arrogance shattered, replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed realization. He pulled out his phone, his thumb trembling as he tried to dial, but an agent was already there, gently but firmly removing it from his grip. "Julian Thorne, you are under arrest for federal mail fraud, conspiracy to commit economic sabotage, and the racketeering of state-protected assets," the agent recited, his voice monotone and cold. The cuffs clicked, a sound that echoed the very ones the sheriff had brought for Arthur the day before. The circle had closed. The trap that had been set months ago, using the Miller farm as the lure, had finally snapped shut. Arthur emerged from the house, stepping off the porch to stand beside the judge. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just watched as the man who had tried to erase his entire life was walked toward a transport vehicle in disgrace. The power of this moment lies in the subversion of expectations. The audience expects a physical brawl, a loud confrontation. Instead, they get the cold, clinical application of truth. It is far more satisfying to watch a tyrant lose his freedom through the very laws he thought he was above than to see him lose a fight. As the vehicles pulled away, leaving the valley in a silence more profound than any that had come before, the judge turned to Arthur. "The land stays yours," Sterling said, handing him a thick folder containing the deed, now free of any liens or encumbrances. "The state has seized the developer's assets to compensate for the damages they caused to you and the other families in this valley. You aren't just keeping your farm, Arthur. You're being paid for the privilege of keeping it." Arthur looked at the folder, then at his fields. The emerald green of the corn looked different now, not like a burden, but like a testament to resilience. He realized that while the system could be used for evil, it could also be the final line of defense for the innocent, provided someone was willing to hold the line. The bad news that changed everything wasn't a tragedy, it was the end of the fear that had been paralyzing the valley. The story concludes here, but the echo remains. We learn that in a world of complex, often invisible structures, the only thing that truly balances the scales is the courage to stand your ground when the law is misapplied. The judge didn't just save a farm, he restored the idea that justice is not something you buy, but something you earn through the cold, hard work of the truth. As the sun fully cleared the horizon, the Miller farm stood silent, unbroken, and finally, unequivocally, free. The struggle had been long, the shadows were deep, but the light that finally caught the valley was the only thing that mattered. The legacy was saved, and the architects of its destruction were gone, erased from the very soil they sought to steal.